Chapter 6 of It Happened in Egypt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It Happened in Egypt by Charles Norris Williamson and Alice Muriel Williamson. Chapter 6. The Great Sir Marcus. The appointment was at the Semiramis Hotel, where Sir Marcus Lark was staying. I went with my mind an aching void, and my heart a cold boiled potato. I can think of nothing more disagreeable, for not a word more would Fenton let drop as to the great man's business with us or the mountain of the Golden Pyramid. I sent up my card, and a few minutes later was shown into a private salon more appropriate to a beautiful young duchess than to a middle-aged, bumptious financier. It was pale green and white, full of lilies and fragrance, and an immense French window opened out onto a roofed loggia overlooking the Nile. This would have been the ideal environment for our gilded rose, and I felt more venomous than before, if possible, toward the rich bounder who posed against such an unsuitable background. I thought, as the door of the salon was opened for me by the smart Arab servant, that the room was untenanted, and that Sir Marcus Lark meant to keep me waiting. But there he was on the balcony, gazing in rapture at the shining river. As if he were capable of raptures, he, an earth-bound worm! But there was no mistaking that back, those shoulders, or the face, as the big body turned. He advanced through the open window, holding out a hand as big as a stake. He was exactly like his photograph, except that there was even more of him than I had been led to expect. The pretty room was not small, but entering he seemed to turn it into a doll's house parlour. 6'2" if he's an inch, I said to myself, longing to play David to his Goliath. Big, rich, common brute, I thought. You snatch our mountain out of our mouths, then you send for us as if we were servants, men whose boots you ought to be blacking. I was vindictive. I stared him straight between the eyes, where a stone from David's sling would have fitted in neatly. The eyes were wide apart, and kinder than in the photographs. They were even curiously innocent and boyish. His grin of greeting made the large, waxed black moustache point joyously up. He showed teeth as white as a child's, and had dimples, actually dimples, in his big cheeks, to say nothing of the one in his chin, with which snapshots had familiarized me. He looked a huge, overgrown schoolboy with a corked moustache. My glare faded in the light of his smile. No man with a gleam of humour could have kept a mask of grimness. I found my hand enveloped in the pound of steak, and warmly shaken up and down inside it. "Lord Ernest Borrow, I'm delighted to see you. Very good of you to come, I'm sure," to David quoth Goliath, in a big voice, mellow despite a slight Cockney accent. "Nice view I've treated myself to here, what? I'm in Egypt on business, but I like to have pretty things around me. Pleasant colours and flowers and a view. That's a specialty of mine. I'm great on specializing. And that brings me to what we have in common, a scheme of yours, a scheme of mine." I wanted to detest the man, but somehow couldn't. To hate him would be hating an overpowering force like heat or electricity. With an old-fashioned politeness he made me sit down, picking out my chair, the most comfortable in the room, then taking the next best for himself. He fitted into it as tightly as a ripe plum into its skin, and talked with one leg crossed over the other and swinging, the points of his brown fingers joined. I was glad they were brown. "I'm afraid you're sore with me," he began, having ordered coffee and liqueurs, and forced upon his guest a cigar as big as a sausage. "I've got what you and your friend wanted, and I'm going to be frank with you as I've been with him, and admit that I got it because you did want it. Simply and solely for that reason and nothing else. He told you this?" "He left the telling to you," I said, wondering why I wasn't more furious than curious. But it was the other way around. "Good egg! He promised he would, and he looks the sort of chap to keep a promise. Well, I see you want me to get down to business, and I will. I'm going to lay all my cards on the table. I came here to Egypt for the first time in my life to see a scheme through, and I landed on the scene in time to find that I was likely to fail. I haven't told anyone else that, but your friend Fenton, for I never have made a business failure yet, and I don't mean to now if I can help it. The scheme had to be saved in a hurry if it could be saved at all, and when I set my wits to work I saw that I must get hold of some such young men as you and Captain Fenton to help me. I don't know how the thought of you two popped into my head, but I suppose it was seeing a lot of stuff about Fenton in the papers, his Balkan adventure, and the announcement that he'd been recalled to his regiment. There were paragraphs about him as a linguist and an Egyptologist, and anecdotes of him as a smart soldier. You know the sort of thing. And the stories about his parentage caught my fancy a bit. They're romantic. I've got enough romance in me to see that side of life, and know how it goes down with the women. This scheme of mine depends on women. Most schemes do. At the same time the Egyptian papers were printing paragraphs about Lord Ernest Borrow. I don't know whether you're aware of that or not? No? Would you like to see him? I've had my secretary cut him out, and the Fenton stuff too. The minute this idea began to wiggle in my mind like a tadpole in water, I kept everything. Don't trouble about the paragraphs, thanks, I said. All right, it will save our time not to. But your wish to go in with your friend, for the rights of excavating in the Sudan, was mentioned, and the delay on account of alleged interference with Garstang's pitch. By Jove, I wonder how the reporters got on to that, I couldn't help exclaiming. It's their livelihood to get on to everything. Well then, I said to myself, here's my chance, my only one. I want those two young men. They're the right combination for me, to give real distinction to my undertaking. I have money, but they ain't the sort you can buy with money. There must be an incentive. If I get what they want, perhaps I can get them. So I went into the job tooth and nail. Neither you nor Fenton was on the spot. I was, very much on it. Nothing was definitely fixed up between the government and Fenton for the right to excavate at the Mountain of the Golden Pyramid, as they call the little old molehill, and I scored. Now, if you two will do what I want, you can have your mountain, and whatever you find you can keep. You're worth more to me than any beads and broken-nosed statues under the sands of Egypt. I think I've made some impression on your friend. He may be inclined to go in with me if you will. He's explained that in any case he can't use his own name, on account of his position in the army, and so on. That's a disappointment to me, but I'll put up with it for the sake of his accomplishments and his looks. Your name alone will carry the necessary weight as a leader. You're very flattering, I said, but I'm in the dark. I'm going to put you wise, as Americans say. My scheme was, and is, to be a rival de luxe of Cook on the Nile. Not only that, but all over the Near East. You've heard, of course, about my buying the Marquis of Redruth's yacht Candace on his bankruptcy, the second biggest and the most up-to-date yacht in the world, and turning her into a pleasure cruiser for the Mediterranean? If I've heard, I'm afraid my memory's treacherous, said I, glad to show how unimportant to me were the schemes of financiers, but interested in the yacht's name, which carried my thoughts away to Meraux. Great Scott! And I've spent 2,000 in advertising! I've taken whole pages of London and Continental papers. I never read advertisements if I can help it, except of new patents and razors. They're a fad of mine. Thank goodness you've got fads, then we've something in common. I make money out of my fads. I call 'em inspirations. I thought the Candace business was one of my inspirations, and that I'd have some fun out of it. I advertised her to start on her first pleasure cruise from Marseilles to Gib, Algiers, Tangier, Tunis, Greece, Alexandria, and Jaffa. That'll be a smack in the eye for the big liners, I said to myself. I'll skim the top layer of clotted cream off their passenger lists. I was going to do the thing de luxe straight through, bid for the swell set, exclusiveness my motto. Of course I didn't expect to hit the Dukes and Dollar Kings first shot, but I thought if everything went right the passengers would tell their friends at home how much better we did them on board than anyone else had ever done, and we'd get a snowball ad that nothing could stop. All would have worked out first rate if I hadn't made one mistake. I engaged a retired army colonel for a conductor on board my yacht. I got the man cheap. But I was a fool to economize on him. I ought to have launched out on a belted earl. Folks, especially Americans, don't like retired colonels. The woods are full of 'em over there, crawling with 'em. Most Americans are colonels and not retired. Besides, this chap of mine's no good anyhow, fancies himself as a politician, and is a first-class snob, has no tact, rubs up the passengers the wrong way, and outrages their feelings. We got a lot of people from the north of England, rich and a bit crude like me. Will you believe it, Colonel Corcoran began his job by sneering audibly at provincials to some beastly friend of his, come to see him off at Marseilles? Instead of making his dinner table lectures a kind of travelogue as he was hired to do, he turns 'em into political tirades, and calls the Liberals scoundrels